Hello, everyone, and welcome to AWS for Games Partner Profiles, where we interview AWS game technology partners, break down their offerings, and help you jumpstart your cloud development journey. My name is Chris Melissinos, and I'm the Principal Evangelist for Video Games at AWS. And on today's program, I sit down with the co-founder and CEO of Heroic Labs, Chris Molozian, to discuss the technology and services that they offer to help game developers of any size deploy multiplayer games, manage LiveOps services, and rapidly customize and test new features and offerings for players through their integrated technology stack. We have a lot to cover, so let's jump in and welcome Chris to the program. All right. Hey, Chris, why don't you tell our audience a bit about Heroic Labs? How did you get started, and what does the company look like today?
No problem. So we were founded in summer of 2015. We've been around a long time now. We're fiercely independent, and we work with game studios on server-based game tech. We work on games that we refer to as live games, and we've been doing that for a long time with many different game studios over the years.
Now, did you have a background in games prior to starting Heroic Labs? Kind of how did you form the company?
So we founded the company from a background of being server engineers. So my background was in database technology. I actually worked on database problem solving for Rovio Entertainment, the guys at Riot Games, for League of Legends. I worked with them as part of a database company, solving some of the scaling challenges. And as I saw a lot of those issues that they were encountering, these massive player bases and these massive highs and lows, peaks and troughs throughout a 24-hour period, we realized that this is sort of a problem that looks like dealing with large-scale social networking, right? Every single game world at scale ends up looking like a social network. And so for us, that motivated us to build what we now call Nakama today. That's what started us off.
All right, Chris, it may be really helpful to walk through an example of how LiveOps are utilized and how they can impact kind of the engagement with your player base and the opportunities that they can present.
So the best example I like to use is if I have some kind of store or shop system. Let's take a game like Fall Guys, right? It's got a huge amount of kind of cosmetics and player customization that users can acquire sort of in-game currency and be able to unlock that to personalize their character when they're playing in the game world, right? This is kind of the kind of sweet spot of personalization that doesn't actually turn into pay to win. It doesn't affect the actual progress of the player. But what you might want to do is be able to surface in a more personalized way to that player. Looks like you've collected these kind of items, these kind of cosmetics, these kind of elements that have personalized your character, and surface promotions or changes to the shop system that make that particular interaction with that shop system unique to the player. Right? It's not just about offers, it's about maybe dynamically pricing the whole thing, right, or tuning these parameters, changing them, trying them with multiple variants under an experiment to figure out what works best for the player base. And this is a good example of using Satori, right? You can take the core game data from whatever game backend you're using, whether it's Nakama or something else, because remember, these pieces of game tech are loosely coupled. You could pull in Satori, apply it to your shop system, and say, actually, I'd like to be able to tweak what the player sees. I'd like to be able to tune what the player sees to something that is bespoke to them. And that involves interacting with the information we already know about the progress the players made in the game world, all of that event data that we captured, using that to place a change in front of them by fetching this overlay of information we want to change about the shop system through something like remote configuration or running an experiment. And the possibilities here around personalizing, if you think about this applied to a shop system, but more broadly, it can be applied to anything in the game world that you think it might be worth trying different variations of. That's the ultimate goal here. How can I try different variations in front of some sets of players to improve how they enjoy the game.
That is fascinating, right? Because you are giving developers the ability to start seeing what works and what doesn't work. And sometimes, it's not quite as obvious. And being able to just surface either items or engagement or quests or anything that you'd want to go and build out of these that fit the way I play for the types of game loop, that I may go ahead and exhibit, the type of people or groups that I like to play with, right? That may be less skilled than, people that have a lot more time to play online than I do. You're giving developers the ability to start playing with a whole variety of different solutions, experiences, and offerings that can speak to the individual player inside of this common game framework.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Chris, thanks for the background on the company. You've been at this for a little while. And what I'd like to do is have you describe what are the main technologies or components that Heroic Lab offers, and why did you name them the way you did, right? I think there's a very interesting story there. So please walk us through the services and technology that Heroic Lab offers to game developers today.
Sure, absolutely. So let's start with Nakama. If we talk about our origin and the realization that we had that our game tech really needs to solve the kind of deeply social problems that you see in large-scale social networks, then it inspired us to name it through a Japanese term, which is roughly translates as friends who are as close as family. And so that's where our game tech came from. The origin was for building Nakama. Now, it's a game backend. It's a multiplayer engine. It's great for certain types of multiplayer games, games like Clash Royale style PvP real-time mechanics, games like Matchmasters, those kind of highly scalable social multiplayer games. And it includes a huge amount of other first-party functionality. The social features around friends, guild systems, social sign-in, tournaments, leaderboards, all of the competitive APIs you'd expect in a good, solid, scalable, production-ready, modern game backend. And then it's got a whole bunch of real-time features, things like socket messaging for in-app notifications, chat features, matchmaking. We've built all of this stuff up so that game studios don't have to. They can plug it into their games, and then their challenge becomes economy modeling, building the meta systems around that game world. And that's our game backend. Separately, we built Satori. Satori is our LiveOps server. So over the last 8 years of working with game teams, we've seen that a lot of game studios, they stitch together roughly 5 different pieces of technology to form a LiveOps experience. Mm-hmm. Messaging, experimentation, analytics, remote configuration, those, and event capture, those kind of capabilities you usually bolt together with a live events scheduler, and that becomes your LiveOps tooling.
Right.
But what would it look like if you could build that as one product? Build that in a way that game teams can deploy, and they have all of those pieces intrinsically linked together. And that means suddenly you can look over the history of your game and even look at the future predictions of what your game is going to do on the timeline, and see where an experiment might be running or a live event might be happening, or you might be messaging out to players, and you get all of this contextual information in one place. That's the kind of LiveOps experience we're bringing to studios. And then the last piece of the puzzle that we've been solving is the game framework. We call it Hiro. Mm-hmm. We've been working on Hiro about 20 months, and it is a library, software library that a studio can pull in that sits on top of Nakama. It also sits inside your game engine, whether it's Unity engine, Unreal Engine, Godot engine, or some kind of web engine. And it brings in the meta systems that you see in some of the biggest free-to-play games on mobile. Your unlockables, your achievements, your inventory systems, your economy modeling, your event leaderboards, a lot of these gameplay systems. And we were motivated to build this because a lot of studios have been working on these problems for a great number of years. And they are common enough that we felt comfortable with this amount of experience that we have today to be able to solve them in a way that we can help every game team, irrespective of whatever game genre they're working in, whether it's mobile, desktop, console, or web. So that's our game tech. And then all of that, and this is where we help, we get helped, and we help studios working with AWS, can sit on top of our cloud platform, our managed service. And that service allows us to operationalize and make production ready the infrastructure in AWS cloud, so game teams don't have to. Can think of us an extension of their engineering team for deploying our pieces of game tech.
Okay, so Heroic Labs doesn't just provide one particular set of solutions or tools. You're providing basically everything from the managed kind of hosted service to the open source game server, as well as all of the LiveOps pieces that are required, right, for delivering, maintaining, right, and operating these games going forward, and a framework, a toolkit that allows you to rapidly build new services inside of this. So it's not any one piece. You're providing a holistic approach to building, deploying, maintaining, and extending the services that are required for modern online multiplayer games going forward.
Yes, absolutely. But these pieces of tech are also loosely coupled. So a game team that only needs LiveOps can only pull in Satori if that's what they need. Game team that's looking for a back end or wants to add meta play features to their games,
right,
they can pull in Hiro and Nakama. And so we've built these tools so that whatever pain point a game studio is looking to solve, we can try to be as valuable and as helpful as we can be.
So highly
and that's our approach,
right? Highly modularized.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Chris, why don't you walk us through each of these four components that Heroic Labs offers? So the first thing I want to cover is Nakama. And you mentioned that it's open source. And this is something that we typically see in this framework, something that we're big believers in, right? Creating the Open 3D engine and then making that available through the Linux Foundation under the Apache 2 license. So we love open source. Tell us why the decision to make it kind of the core component, right, of Heroic Labs open source.
Good question. So we've tried to make as much of the game tech that we build as possible open source, but we specifically started with Nakama because if you look at the way this piece of technology fits into a game, we liken it to the kind of core infrastructure problems that it's solving that you typically solve when you pick database technology. Now, maybe I'm biased here because of my background in database tech, but a lot of those companies have built success over the last decade by making sure that as many developers as possible can get to play and experience that technology, right? They can benefit from it. And so we took a similar open source philosophy to our game tech Nakama. And that means that, we believe generally that a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we can help a studio team of 3 developers and they can hit that success curve, that maybe they want to transition onto not managing infrastructure, we'd love to help them do that. But at the same time, if we can help the next AAA game project that might be on a, multi-million-dollar budget, 4-year development cycle, also be as successful as possible, then we're sort of helping, both very different ends of that spectrum, but leveling the playing field as well, because we can help everybody compete on a fair ground. And that's only something you can do if you're open source, in our opinion.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, Chris. I mean, really leaning into open source, leveraging the community for feedback, allowing people to experiment with the platforms, make sure that it fits for them, working alongside to help them be successful, right? Open source kind of just removes that economic barrier, right, for developers just to come in and start using the technology.
Absolutely. And it gives them access to tech that could take 18, 24 months, maybe longer to build.
Yeah.
But they're also having to build and solve all the other problems that go into building some of the best games in the market, right? Economy modeling, client engineering, graphics, 2D artistry, 3D modeling, visual effects, animation effects.
Yeah.
Making it fun, right?
Exactly.
Running UA tests or running kind of campaigns to just get feedback from players as early as you can on some kind of beautiful vertical slice of your game. You're doing all of that. And then you're building this foundational set of game tech on top. That means that you're trying to compete with what the existing market is able to do for players, that's really hard to compete in if you try to take on all those problems all at once.
Yeah, look, I've always said, game developers took their brilliance, right, and their expertise and decided to become game developers, not to become cloud practitioners, right? So collectively, it is our responsibility to help get the technology out of the way so developers can just focus on making better games, more content, more experiences, more smiles in the world, right? And that's what Heroic Labs is able to go ahead and help developers start to do. So let's go ahead and jump into each one of these 4 components, and let's start with Nakama. All right, Chris, why don't you walk us through what Nakama is?
Absolutely. So Nakama, we broadly speaking break down the features that we package with the game tech into these 3 categories: social, real-time, and competitive. And we do this because they're a nice way to bucket problem areas that game teams are constantly trying to solve as they're building the next massive game, the next live game. On the social side, we cover friends, we cover guild systems, we have a storage engine that allows you to flexibly search for other players and compete with them. On the real-time side of things, we've got chat features, we've got the multiplayer engine that I mentioned a little earlier, we've got APIs for sending in-app notifications, we've got features for doing a bunch of status updates so that players can see when their friends come online. And then on the competitive side, we've got all of those layers you need to build this comparison that you need for players between each other: tournaments, leaderboards, matchmaking systems, league systems, all of those kind of gameplay APIs. And alongside all of this, we provide a server framework, what we call the cloud runtime. And that system lets studios take these features and stitch them together with their own custom logic. And that logic is what enables them to build the unique gameplay elements that differentiates their game from everybody else, right? It's that layer of creativity that you don't want to constrain a studio around. So you need to give them the freedom to express that. And that's what we do through our server framework, is let them write in 4 different programming languages: Go, Lua, TypeScript, and JavaScript, and come in and build what is going to be the differentiation for them when they're engaging players in their game world.
Right. So it's basically allowing them to build features that differentiate them versus having to build undifferentiated technologies to deliver that differentiation, right?
That's absolutely
what takes care of.
Where those undifferentiated pieces are ultimately not going to enable the studio to most effectively make use of that time that they have, that development budget that they have, right, to be successful. A leaderboard is complicated to get right. A friends list and a guild system is complicated to get right. It's difficult to make intrinsically differentiated, but it also needs to scale exceptionally well. And we've removed those challenges away from the studio. So binding on top of that, whatever rules that make sense for the game world, when players can join guilds and, what constitutes gifting within the friends list, and those kind of things become more interesting that the studio can work on.
Yeah. And then again, you've made it easier for developers to integrate into a legacy pipeline or into their workflow that may have been building for quite some time, right? As you mentioned, with it being open source, you can integrate into basically any engine that you want to go ahead and take on the task of integrating to, although you already do work with Godot, Unity, Unreal, Open 3D Engine folks, take note, right? There's an opportunity to integrate here as well. But then for your real-time multiplayer services, being able to customize the client with, Go or TypeScript or Lua, right? You're giving optionality to developers to be able to go ahead and kind of bend the services to be what they need them to be based on their expertise in languages, platforms, and workflow.
Exactly. Yes. And that means that they can, from a development process perspective, pull in engineers that maybe even have a web background. They're comfortable in TypeScript and JavaScript, and be as productive as they need to be, and stitch together these foundational APIs in a way that they want to be creative in their games.
All right. And that's Nakama. All right, Chris. So moving on to Satori. So please explain to us what Satori is.
Sure. So Satori is our LiveOps server. Now, the challenge with the word LiveOps is depending on the types of game projects that studios are working on, LiveOps can mean a few different things. Some studios, they think of it as analytics, sort of data science. Some studios might think of it as leaderboards and live gameplay. And then there's those studios that think about experimentation and player gameplay optimization. What we've done is consolidated all of those sorts of definitions and broken the problem space down into these sort of 6 pods. You've got the event capture pipeline. You need to bring in the fire hose of analytics events that come from game clients. You need to do this because you need to understand what time players are spending in the game world, how they're spending it, what they're interacting with, and capture all of that event information so that you can optimize their play experience. And so you do that against the player identity, and then those player identities are segmented. You're right. You break them down, you bucket them into smaller groups of players so that you can target them. And the targeting is for the purpose of running live events, for the purpose of modifying the player experience through remote configuration or feature flags, messaging to those players, telling them about upcoming live events or new DLCs that might be available for them to play in, and then doing all of this with experimentation. And this becomes a workflow that a studio goes through, but usually they're doing this with 4 or 5 different tools stitched together.
Right.
And maybe with their own event scheduling system, because that tends to be a problem that's not solved in the market. Whereas what we've done is we've brought all of these foundational pieces together and put it into one product.
So basically, the LiveOps are all of the features, services, engagement opportunities, feedback, segmentation of the communities and the player base that happens after the game is launched. So this is, you got your game developed, you've now launched it, it's now running up on Nakama and people are having a good time playing. And then the LiveOps piece is the actual maintaining of the operation of that game and all of those components that we just discussed moving forward. So a framework in which to go ahead and do that and a server in which to operate them.
Yes, absolutely. And ultimately, the moment a game goes live, you need to start thinking about what you can do to learn how to best serve your players.
Exactly.
And to do that, you need to be able to listen to them. And in reality, there's not many ways to be able to do that. You can, set up Discord channels, you can talk to your community, you can get feedback that way in small, amounts of information flow. You can go and reach out to them in game and ask for player feedback and maybe incentivize them in some way to give you that feedback. But where LiveOps comes in as a strategy is all about taking a much wider lens to the problem. What can I learn about every interaction that all players in my game world are having? Mm-hmm. And how can I use that to build a better experience for them? Build a more engaging game, adjust the difficulty curve of the gameplay, tweak and change what kind of progress affects the way their game world is unlocked for them to be able to partake in live events or similar. All of those elements that really drive the kind of successes you see where games like Candy Crush and Supercell's games, are running these kind of LiveOps workflows and have been for a decade.
Yeah, look, I mean, these are solving problems that back in the day we wish we had access to, right? The only way you knew what the features or services were of the player base when you shipped, packaged product versus LiveOps was, well, I'll wait for reviews to come out in a magazine or wait for them to hit online to figure out what the gaps are. This allows you from day one to best understand the needs of your players, how to smooth out the experience to make it better for a wider number of players, and to create experiences within the game framework that speak to a variety of different players. So super important when you're deploying your online multiplayer games to a global audience of mixed demographics, of mixed devices, of mixed player types, to best engage them all to the best of your ability.
Absolutely. And this is more important than ever if you think about the way we're being impacted as a market to be able to reach the player.
Yeah.
Right. Changes to the way that we can reach players through advertising systems, make it much, much harder to be able to reach the right kind of player that's going to enjoy playing the game. So the sooner you can get feedback to be able to improve it for a wider audience of players, the better your retention is going to be, which might even save on the huge amounts of money that has to be spent today bringing games to market and reaching players.
Sure. All right, Chris. So we talked earlier on about getting the technology out of the way for game developers, right? For those back-end undifferentiated services, so they can build differentiation for their products, for their games, for their communities. So if I already have Nakama on the back end as the server, and I already have Satori there for LiveOps, what does Hiro give me as a game developer? Why does it make it better or easier to use Heroic Labs suite with Hiro?
It's a great question. Hiro was born of a recurring request that we had from studio teams, where they were comfortable in Nakama. They were successful at building these gameplay systems on top of Nakama, like we talked about earlier, being able to stitch together the first-party features of the game server with their own custom logic.
Right.
But they were doing this for features that was repetitive to their development workflow. They'd done it for inventory once. They were doing it for inventory the next game through. And they wanted from us to see how we could help them in solving this problem. And so we looked at whether we could templatize things. Could we just give templates to developers and say, actually, here's a template for solving these particular problems?
Right.
But then we realized that you still need the flexibility to allow the studio team to customize things. And if it's a template, then you can't help them with upgrades and modification cycles. So we figured out that the best way to sort of package this was as a library. And that way, studio teams that don't feel like it's worth their engineering time to build these kind of gameplay systems can take advantage of Hiro. Whereas those who want to build these layers up themselves still have the freedom to do so. And so Hiro, it's a library that solves a set of common gameplay systems. Right. Again, lifting the abstraction for a game team. Which game that's server-based have we played that didn't have an inventory system? They all need one, right? Which games have we played that don't have some way of rewarding players, right? Through some set of reward mechanisms. And so what we did was we codified that, we modeled that out for the game studios. And that's what's become Hiro. It's our way of saying to a game studio, if you're interested in using this library, it tightly integrates with your engine, Godot engine, Unity engine, Unreal engine, or a web engine of Pixie.js or any of the others in the market. And instead, focus again on what makes your game design different, but allow the designers to come in and model their economy for the game world much, much sooner. So again, it's all about helping to accelerate game teams.
Yeah. And so look, made me think when we were talking about these kind of same common features, and we mentioned earlier, how many different ways can you write a leaderboard? Well, it doesn't matter which leaderboard is being deployed. 60, 70% of the features are the same. So why do we constantly go back and rebuild leaderboards over and over again, right? Hollywood learned a long time ago, you don't need to build a new mansion every time you want to film a movie with a mansion in it. You can repaint it. You can put new furniture. Like, you can use those core pieces and then modify on top for a particular audience. This basically is the same thing. Let's go ahead and take the leaderboard component there. We'll templatize that, wrap those pieces together, provide a higher level API stack that allows a game developer to then focus on customizing, modifying, or extending that core implementation. So on top of Nakama, on top of Satori, you are creating these templates through Hiro that allow game developers to deploy important core services and make it easier for them to modify and make it their own. Correct? Does that sound about right?
That's perfect. And I think that modification piece is what's so critical here, is we've approached the problem in such a way as to say, if you have your game design requirements, if your studio GDD, the game design document, if your game team has a particular way they want these features to work, you can still customize it. Because what you can often find in the market is solutions that you're squashed into fitting. The solution doesn't fit you, you fit what the solution does. And we've tried through this approach to be as flexible as we can be while still giving studios more that they don't need to build from scratch.
All right, Chris. So we walked through the Nakama backend server. We walked through the Satori LiveOps platform. We walked through Hiro, which is the templatized features that developers can deploy quickly and extend and customize for their own use. But now we want to wrap all of this up together and actually get it onto servers and actually operate that. But I may not have a lot of expertise in hosting on a cloud provider. So tell me about Heroic Cloud and what does it provide to your customers?
The Heroic Cloud, best way to describe it is it's our managed service for running our game tech. So Nakama is open source. We talked about that. You could run it yourself on AWS if you wanted to. But for studio teams that want production-ready deployments with a managed service that allows them to have a team of engineers helping to keep that game running and up and available at scale, that's where our cloud platform comes in. And it's built on top of AWS. We're in multiple AWS regions. And we stitch together for you as part of a deployment everything you'd need to be production ready. So you can think of the load balancers, the server instances for the game server side, the database instances. We do everything for log aggregation, metric capture, database backups, storage at rest, all of that problem space that goes into stitching together, cloud infrastructure for a game that's going to run at massive scale. And we do all of this on dedicated hardware for each game project. So something slightly different about our cloud platform to some of the sort of services in the market is we're not a multi-tenant service. I think this is an important call out because the advantage of this is that you don't end up with performance hotspots or noisy neighbor issues because of another game that's running on that shared hardware that might end up having some kind of performance problem or might have some kind of inbound UA campaign that is stealing resources that are being shared by too many different game projects. We don't solve the problem in that way at all. We believe in providing dedicated infrastructure to every game. And that gives it the freedom to scale resources in a much more fine-grained fashion, in a much more cost-conscious way, but also in a way that will not be affected by other running games on the platform.
Okay, so if I'm a game developer that doesn't have any experience in building these types of services, and I just want kind of a turnkey partner on the back end that's going to help me run this stuff, Heroic Cloud is the way to go.
Yeah, I would say the workflow there for a developer, there's two pathways in, but the preferred pathway is jump into their AWS account, jump into the AWS marketplace, click a button there, and you'll get a Heroic Cloud account created. And then you can click a couple of buttons in a turnkey way, as you mentioned, that will manage and deploy and configure all of that infrastructure. And that means that you end up within minutes with all of the resources ready to go for running your live game.
So Chris, maybe you can walk us through some of the companies that you're currently working with that are building on or deploying using Heroic Labs, and then maybe talk about some of the different game types that are being deployed using your technology stack.
So one of the really nice things about the open source model that we have with Nakama is that we have really been able to fulfill that philosophical goal of, are we able to help game teams, of the smallest of sizes, really bring to market some of the best games in the world and even compete against some of the largest games publishers in the world. And here you can see this fantastic mixture of game publishers, indie studios, AA independent studio teams, mid-tier studios, and that are launching games on desktop, console, web, and mobile. And that allows the small studios to compete with the big juggernauts in the market, and the big publishers to be able to ship games quicker. And we're proud of being able to do both.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you're also focusing on the widest spectrum of game developer size, right? Because a mega hit can come from anywhere. Flops can come from anywhere too, right? And the size
Absolutely
doesn't necessarily guarantee success. So by making it easier for any developer of any size to be able to stand up, deploy, operate, and extend their games to their audience, increases the chance for them to find an audience faster, to find a smoother gameplay experience for that audience, to continue to climb and grow, and hopefully help cultivate more hits, right, across the global game catalog that we all enjoy.
Absolutely. And here, some of these game teams have launched titles that are sitting at millions and millions of DAU. And that means they're delighting player bases every day at just massive scale.
Well, maybe you can show us some of the game types that are currently and titles that are currently being deployed on Heroic Labs solutions.
So this is one of my favorite examples of just the sheer diversity of different games that we can support and that we've helped studios build. You've got grand strategy, merging games, extraction shooters, tower defense, match merging, wordplay puzzle games, and hyper casual and hybrid casual. And so we've covered a huge, diverse array of different game genres. And that will just continue to grow as we help more and more studios launch to different markets, launch to different device platforms, and build different unique subgenres of gameplay.
Right. So any developers that want to go ahead and deploy and have the type of scale that these types of games enjoy, bring them onto Heroic Labs on AWS, and you too can go ahead and deploy your games to a global audience and meet the scale that your player base demands. Okay, Chris, so you walked us through, again, the offerings from Heroic Labs, the customers that are using it. So I'm a game developer and I've got an interest in starting to explore my journey on Heroic Labs. But price is a big consideration for any game developer, from indies to the biggest today. How much is it going to cost me to get up and running on Heroic Labs? How do I find that information out?
Great question. So on our homepage, you can find clearly at the top, we've got our pricing tab. If we navigate over to that, I'll run you through a bit of our approach to pricing. Okay, so everything is slider bar driven here. You can get all of that dedicated hardware that I talked about earlier on the Heroic Cloud deployed with a minimum commitment in development of $420 a month and in production ready at $600 a month. But what you'll find quite interesting here is we don't charge by MAU, DAU, or CCU. We don't really believe in charging against these kind of variable player activity level figures. Because ultimately, when you're running a UA campaign and you're having players coming in, whatever mechanism you're using to reach those players, that's a lot of money being spent to advertise, to get players in, that then ends up being additional spend that you shouldn't have to take on while you're figuring out how many of those players that you can keep in and retain.
Right.
So we take a different approach. We don't use this sort of, let's call it a SaaS type pricing model. Instead, because we deploy dedicated hardware, we can give you this sort of virtualized CPU unit, like we have here in our slider, and use that in simple terms to model out what it looks like to scale. And so you can think, I will maximize the hardware I'm using here for my game project. And if that means I'm doing, something like maybe a couple of 100K DAU, then so much the better for it, because that means that you can model out what it looks like to build success in the game. And so for us, the pricing model is very, very predictable. It's easy to reason through and it's easy to calculate. which gives a great amount of peace of mind to a game team that's otherwise trying to figure out through complicated internal spreadsheets how to break that cost up, for how their game is using various features and functionality. And you can go through our pricing page. You can see these things reflected throughout here. If you're looking to have specialized support from us, special commitments for SLAs, we operate similarly to the way a cloud provider like AWS operates, where you can have these support packages up for your cloud usage. And then, of course, we support the ability to do professional services engagements for game teams that want us to do training or want us to work on a long-term basis or something that's more short-term. And then finally, if you'd like us to help you deploy our infrastructure inside your own AWS account, we can do that as well. So this is the way that we operate with game teams. And which approach a game team takes is entirely up to what fits the kind of infrastructure budgeting they've got in mind as they think about taking the project into production.
And what I love about your approach, it's really clear and straightforward. I like the fact that in your slider here on the page, if you scroll it up just a little bit, you can see, what the average range of those deployments look like. So you can start to understand, if you don't have a lot of experience in building these things, well, guess what? You probably don't need 16 CPUs on the back. You may think you do. So you're informing people, even just through the calculator here, to make the best decision, most cost-effective way for them to get started exploring, utilizing Heroic Labs solutions for their games. And they can even start for free just by using Nakama and getting kind of their hands around the technology and start to experiment maybe, on-prem before they decide to deploy to a cloud solution, correct?
Absolutely. That's the beauty of open source.
Yeah.
They can download, they can run it wherever they like, they can run it locally. And you could be on an airplane and building your server-based game and preparing for what that next deployment looks like to push it into production.
All right, Chris, you walked us through all the services and opportunities available to developers, the customers that are using it, and the pricing looks good. Now, as a new developer, how do I get started on my journey with Heroic Labs?
I think there are two pathways for this. I would say that if you're a developer that wants to learn and play with the technology, I would go down the open source route. Jump straight to the download link. You can find Nakama on GitHub. You can grab a download of it. You can follow our documentation. You can navigate here to our documentation, follow our getting started and our install guides. And that gives you the fastest way to play and play locally on your machine and not worry about infrastructure, not worry about deployments, not worry about scaling. Then as you're thinking about going into production, then you would look at signing up to the Heroic Cloud. That would be a destination to choose for you as a game team where you don't want to manage infrastructure yourself. In that case, you can deploy through the AWS marketplace. You can reach it in the Heroic Cloud on an AWS region, and we'll manage that infrastructure for you. That to me is the two pathways here. Now, where you jump between one and the other could be you have your first set of test flight builds. On mobile, it would be test flight. Maybe you're running early access builds on Steam network. You want to be able to have playable builds that you can distribute online for your game being server-based, right? It's social, it's real-time, it's multiplayer, it's competitive. You want it to be up and online somewhere for players to reach. That could be the best trigger point for moving on to the Heroic Cloud.
Great. And then to help people on that journey, you have a variety of different community components, a forum, forums on GitHub, you host a blog, you have YouTube channel, you also have tutorials and guides. So you provide basically a lot of information for self-starters to go ahead and jump in, download, learn, and start playing around with Nakama today.
Absolutely. We've been working heavily over the last few years on that developer experience.
Yeah.
Because
well, you're making it too easy.
That's the goal, right? If we can have developers and engineers find that working with the game tech is effortless, then we know we've done the right thing. Yeah. It should be something they don't have to think about as a problem, and they think about as a solution to a pain point.
Yeah. All right, Chris. So what are the 3 big takeaways that any developer should think about when considering Heroic Labs?
I would say the first big takeaway is that we have built game tech to help game teams of every size. So this is not tech that is suited to a particular size of development team. It's something that we believe can help every studio. So give it a look and just play with it. We think that with our pieces of game tech products, Hiro, Satori, and Nakama, we have a solution to some kind of pain point, no matter where you are in that game production pipeline. So we'd love to be able to help studios solve those problems and help any developer solve those problems as they build their next big game. I think that's point number 1. For me, number 2 is we're open source. We have a massive developer community. We've done about 7.2 million downloads to date. And so get stuck in, join the community, get on our forums, ask questions. You know, we regularly have our core engineering team hanging out in that space to get feedback, to see what we can do to make things easier for game teams. So we love that open source philosophy, and that gives you a chance to be a part of that community and give us feedback. And we will make it better for every developer.
Great.
And then last thing, I think I would say that with our open source model, you can go and download this tech today. You can run it locally. You can play with it. You can start prototyping. For free. You can start prototyping and experimenting and, trialing what it would mean to make and realize that vision of that next big server game that you're building. Those, I think, are the 3 takeaways.
Yeah, and so you can start for free, and then as you grow, as your needs scale, you offer a variety of different support and hardware and deployment options that your customers can avail themselves of to meet the size of their growth at any point during their development, deployment, and operational life cycle.
Absolutely. Yeah. We will be there at the stage that you're at as a studio to be able to help you in the best way that we can.
All right, I want to thank my guest today, the co-founder and CEO of Heroic Labs, Chris Molozian. Chris, thank you so much for spending time with us and walking us through the offerings that Heroic Labs provides to game developers looking to build their next great online multiplayer game, operate it, and continue to grow that game so they can continue making more art, more games, more smiles for more audiences.
Thank you so much, Chris. Your podcast is great, and it's a pleasure to be part of it.